every single way we look at it, there's a positive relationship, meaning the more the news report on an initial shooting, the more additional shootings we see in the next 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and so on. There isn't even a publicly accepted database on mass shootings in the US. And he asked me, so do you think we cause deaths? And I said, in fact, yes, you are causing death. That cannot be the future in our democracies. Like, we need to be able to disagree and then still find a constructive way forward and keep disagreeing. That's fine. And then we exchange our ideas.
Mass attacks in the public area, including schools, are a rising concern in many countries. Numbers are alarming, and many of us are asking a simple question. What is happening to our world today? And anyway, are we going to feel safe in public areas? Can we feel safe about sending our children to school? And what is the role of media in all this? Tali and I are happy to be here to discuss today this topic on our platform with a highly distinguished researcher in this field, Michael Jetter. Hello, Michael.
Hi, Carolina. Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Hello, Michael, and it's our pleasure to have you here with us, and thank you for being on this interview. And let me introduce you shortly to our audience. So, Michael is an associate professor of economics at the University of Western Australia, and Michael has impressive number of scientific papers on various topics, and among them very painful and harsh topics and public issues. So we know that some of your work is actually focusing on media coverage of mass attacks. And when we came across these papers, the first question we had, like, why not more people talking about this? But first of all, we would like to know why you started investigating this topic and what inspired you to actually deep dive into this issue.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think I started getting interested in this about 10, 12 years ago or so. And I, much like many of you, probably were just sort of taken aback by the sensationalist media coverage that many of these events are getting in many countries. So I lived in the US and I see it in the news there. I'm from Germany originally. I see it in the news there. And what the news media seem to be doing is consistently give these shooters, these perpetrators, a platform. They show their picture, they tell their life story, they make them famous in a nutshell. And the first intuition is kind of that doesn't seem right, because many of them, we know, when you read the pamphlets they leave behind or their writings, they want to be famous. They want to be famous. If they're part of a political group or if they're acting by themselves, they want to be famous. And what does the media do is they give them exactly that. So my thought, I'm an empirical researcher. I want to understand empirical realities, what's happening in the real world. So I started reading up on it, and much to my surprise, like you suggested, there wasn't really an empirical analysis that asked the question, does this media coverage of those perpetrators, does it have any consequences in terms of, do we see more shootings after that? Do we see fewer shootings after that? Or does it have no relationship whatsoever? So I started reading more, and in psychology and political science, there are theories out there about this. And some of them do suggest that, hey, the more coverage, the more fame we give them, the more likely is it that we see copycats, that we see other people doing that too. So I was trying to think of a way to go out and empirically see if that is really reflected in real life data. And that's what I try to do by myself and then also with a co-author. Yeah.
You mentioned your co-author, Dr. Walker, Professor Walker. How did you get to know each other?
Yeah, we actually met in graduate school. We did our PhD in the same place at the same time. And we've been working on many research projects since then, and this was one of them. Yeah.
Great. You also mentioned that you originally come from Germany. If you would compare actually the media coverage of such events that are happening in the United States, and unfortunately, these things also happen more and more in Europe, in Germany as well. If you would compare it, what's the difference? Is there some difference actually between media coverage in the United States and Germany?
That's a really good question. And I think the answer to that is very much informed by our own subjective reading of the news, what kind of news we consume and how we look at these things. So obviously, since I've been doing research on this topic, I look at those news differently, and I actively try to find the news articles about these topics and try to identify patterns. And I think, I mean, my impression is originally the US was more sensationalist with its 24/7 news cycle with the CNNs and the Fox News. And it's just more of a constant grinding of the same news pattern. So I think like 10, 15 years ago, if you look at coverage of one of those shootings, it was often they had like a few 1-2 minute sequences and they kept running them over and over and over because it's 24/7 news. And I think many European countries, I say many, but the ones I observe more closely, like the UK, Germany, France, maybe Spain, I think they're more and more getting sensationalist, is my feeling about these events. But they've also been happening with more frequency. So maybe, that's also happening. It's hard to say. But I think now, in terms of degree of sensationalism, I don't think there's that much difference between the Western countries that I observe. It tends to become actually, if anything, more sensationalist than it was before, which I think is quite concerning.
For our viewers who have not seen your paper, can you walk us through your research and your findings? And what was the most aha moment when you realized that, wow, I really found something that is worth public attention?
So first we try to put together data that captures shootings in the US, for example, mass shootings, and there are different definitions of these, how many people are killed and so on. So try to carefully take into account those different definitions. And that the first surprising thing for us was there isn't even a publicly accepted database on mass shootings in the US, which I found crazy because it's an event that is so much debated and we don't even have properly organized data. There were only sort of 2 or 3 independent think tanks that were putting together these databases going back a couple of decades. But compared to what we have data on all kinds of things, we don't really have great data on that, which I found crazy. So that's the first thing. We tried to put together a comprehensive database of these shootings in the United States. And then we looked at the major publishing outlets, like the television evening news, for example, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so on. And we tried to identify if and how they cover these shootings. And so we try to carefully put these pieces of information together and then try to understand, is there a pattern in the sense that if a shooting happens, do we then see more shootings afterwards? And this is related to how much news coverage the initial shooting receives. And in a nutshell, every way we look at this, which statistically there are many different ways of looking at this, every single way we look at it, there's a positive relationship, meaning the more the news report on an initial shooting, the more additional shootings we see in the next 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and so on. And the obvious concern is, of course, so are the additional shootings caused by the news coverage, or is this just coincidence, right? It could be other factors that lead to a mass shooting, which of course there are. I mean, we can talk about gun rights, we can talk about the younger generation and video games, we can talk about all kinds of topics, and all of these quite potentially play a role. I don't think there's a one explanation for this rise in these shootings. But we try to see if there's any way to causally identify, is it now that we see another shooting because of this initial coverage? And that's what we're trying to test in our paper. And we do that with different statistical ways of isolating these causal relationships. And again, everything we have done consistently shows that pattern, that just because the news report more on it, that's why we see more shootings. And we can quantify it relatively well also. And the numbers are sizable. So whichever way you look at it, just because of that additional coverage that the initial shooting receives, that's why we see more of them. And I think that's quite concerning and policy relevant. And we should talk more about that.
This is absolutely concerning. And When you're saying that there should be actions taken, like from the standpoint of policy, what kind of actions and how should society react and how should policymakers react? What are the possible ways to prevent this wildfire?
I think wildfire is actually an interesting terminology you're using. In a way, it's that. I mean, I think the first step I'd like to see is that we have an open debate about this between media editors, between journalists, between policymakers to try and understand the problem. And I don't see any of that really. And that's really concerning. Now, how we deal with this as a society, there are different ways. Of course, you don't want to jeopardize press freedom. I mean, press freedom is, you don't want to tell a journalist what they can and cannot write. But one thing, there was an aha moment, as you put it, Telly, to me, was if you look at the coverage of suicides in any of our countries, every journalist knows you write very carefully about a suicide. Why? Because you're worried about copycats. So if you say, this 16-year-old male jumped off that bridge to kill himself because his girlfriend broke up with him, nobody writes it. No journalist ever writes it. And every journalist immediately says like, oh yeah, we need to be really careful with talking and writing about suicides because it could have detrimental effects in our society, and other people doing the same thing. So we have an understanding, even in a free press world, we have an understanding among journalists, a voluntary agreement that we write very carefully about suicides. And I dare you to find any sensationalist article in any news outlet about a suicide. You never do really. I've never seen one. And that is because there's an agreement, an understanding among journalists. We write about this carefully. We write about it factually. We don't write it in a sensationalist way. And we usually, at the bottom of those articles, you see helplines for people who are struggling with mental health and so on. So my point is, we have found, as the media community has found a way to deal with this topic that is completely voluntary and completely self-driven and not violating press freedom, where every journalist understands that some events are just different than others, and we need to be careful in reporting on them. So I'm not saying we should apply this one-to-one to public shootings, but I think it's a great starting point to get journalists to understand, wait a minute, I should write about this differently because it might have negative consequences in our society than about other events. And I think that would be a great starting point. And from there, it would be quite constructive, I think, to see what the decision makers in different domains come up with, policymakers, media editors, the public, and so on, businesses as well. So I think that would be a great starting point I'd like to see. And from there, I think we'd find solutions as our societies to deal with this. But at the moment, I see none of that, which is very concerning.
So when you're saying sensationalism, what exactly do you mean by that? How is it different, and what do you see harmful in the way it is presented? Is there a certain starting point where you could actually see that this is where it all escalated drastically?
Oh, that's like a few really interesting questions. A starting point where it escalated, I think, is hard to pin down. I think in many domains and topics, we've seen more sensationalist news reporting. So not just shootings, but many other domains. And it's just sort of the nature of how the media has evolved over the past 20 years, I think, is part of that. But I think once there were very concrete discussions. So I think 7-8 years ago, Le Monde in France actually said publicly, they're not going to publish photos anymore of shooters, and they're not going to name their names, which is sort of in psychology, one branch of research suggests if we show their photos and we show their names, we give them the fame they want. We make them famous. And then Le Monde said, okay, let's just cut that out, because that is really not in the public interest of news. Unless the shooter is still on the run somewhere where you want to publish a picture so people recognize the shooter. If the shooter is captured or dead at that stage, there's no informational value on seeing the face. Yeah, and I might be interested in it because as a spectator, so I want to know more about the story, but the pure informational content, the pure news content is minimal at that stage. So they've made that decision at the time, and it caused an most news outlets across Europe had a comment about it. Either they supported it, but most of them strongly condemned it and saw it as an attack on press freedom. But there are very tangible ways how you could think about what could be curtailed first. So, for example, what determines a sensationalist news element as opposed to an informational news element? Well, if you hear about the sister of the shooter and how 5 years ago she said he's actually a nice guy, is that strongly relevant to the developing story? I don't think so. And I mean, in a way, that definition of what's sensationalist and what not is subjective. But I think most of us see something sensationalist. We realize it when we see it. If it's not really central to the current news content, but rather clickbait and I want to see that. And in a way, it's drawing on this human interest and impulses. We want to learn about what led that person to do something so terrible. But I think there are many news segments we can all point to where we look at the headlines and the article, and there's no informational news content. It is just drawing on this sensationalist urge of people to click on it and try to learn what made this monster do that. And I think, again, that there would be a discussion to have with people in the media editors, and say, where do we draw the line? What do we do? What do we not do? For example, do we need to publish the picture of that guy on the front page and make him famous? And most of the time it's a him. Probably not. Do we need to name them? Do we need to tell his life story on the front page? Maybe not.
Exactly. Yeah, because you were talking about suicides. Actually, there is a recommendation of World Health Organization, which has been updated in 2023, actually giving all these recommendations. Be very careful, not showing pictures, not telling too much about the story and everything. And I'm very concerned because right now I'm in Prague. And last year there was a first big mass shooting, unfortunately school shooting. So really children, students, young people, teachers, and the media coverage that we see is everything, everything wrong that you're talking right now about: picture, story, motive, what was his intention to do this. Once again, more and more with specific media being covered all the time. So really the culture, the ethics of the media is different in different countries. And I'd like to know do you have some picture what is happening, for example, in this regard in Australia? Was the situation about mass shootings in Australia, is it different or?
So luckily we didn't have many mass shootings recently. That's one part of that is many researchers are suggesting it's the gun control that is much stronger here, but I'm not sure how much that is true. That's not my domain to debate. There have been knife attacks recently here, but the basic reporting pattern, I think, is the same. It's going into a sensationalist direction. It's trying to very catchily looking at what's the perpetrator's background, and look, he had some ties to an Islamic group or had some ties to a far-right group. And you can tell most journalists are advancing their own political agenda in a way. So in the US, you can usually immediately see in the first paragraph that a journalist tries to push gun control when they bring in that the obvious reason for this happening in the US is the number of guns and the loose gun controls, to which it's an interesting debate to have, but you don't want a journalist to go into something like that. So with such preconceived notions and political ideas. So I think cross country, I speak German, English, and Spanish. So my look across countries is limited by that. But I think the basic pattern of sensationalist coverage is present in all the societies I can see: Australia, New Zealand, the US, the UK, Germany. I've seen a little bit of France as well, Spain. The basic tendency is there. And it's very similar across these countries. I've not seen a basic awareness of a media landscape that treats those events differently, like something like suicides, for instance. So, and that's unfortunate, because I think it would be relatively straightforward to have that conversation in journalism schools and amongst media editors. And I think it'd be beneficial to our societies to have that. But unfortunately, I don't see it happening in any of our countries. I hope I'm wrong. Maybe I'm missing some of these movements, but I just don't see it. And it sounds to me what you're describing in Prague, that the reporting on that wasn't what we'd like it to be either.
Yeah, you know, when you brought up this example of a French newspaper, Le Monde, right, who actually proposed to lower the sensationalism around this personalities and just openly do not make them rock stars, right? Because to get on the cover on Rolling Stone magazine, you either have to be a Mick Jagger and sell millions of albums, or you can do something very bad and basically get the same level of fame. So that's a no-brainer that there are certain things that people do for fame, and some people specifically do it for that reason. So if they know they're not gonna get that fame, they might have less motivation to do these things, right? So, and nevertheless, you say the reaction from the press was overwhelmingly negative, and the justification was freedom of speech. How does it make any sense to basically justify creation of new crimes with the freedom of speech when it's direct harm to society? Like, how is this argument even able even passing in the media field? Like, how is it not getting outrage from the public and from the journalists who actually have some sort of dignity?
That's a really good question. So at the time when I published my first paper around this, I had quite a few conversations with journalists, and it was very interesting. Every single one of them, as soon as I brought up the suicide example, they went, oh yeah, yeah, of course suicides are different. It's like, well, so of course shootings are different, and you should think about these differently. The reason why I think there's not a discussion and a debate about that is because I don't think there's public pressure about it. And we're humans. We go with what we've been doing before. If I'm a journalist and the past 10 years I've been reporting a certain way, and just because some sort of researcher says this might be bad, I'm not going to change my pattern, especially if the journalists around me are still doing the same thing. If I'm the only newspaper that doesn't do that, probably that newspaper thinks we're going to be punished by our readers or by our viewers, if it's a TV station. So there needs to be, I think, enough public pressure to say, media editors, do better. Think about something to address this within the bounds of free speech and using examples. Like a suicide, I think, is the best example in terms of topics where we immediately understand it's important how we report on it. And the empirical and the theoretical evidence we have in terms of these mass shootings strongly points to that theory being true, that the more you report on it, just because of that, you see more of them. In fact, if you think sort of, so some people, especially journalists, some you statisticians and you can manipulate the numbers and all of this stuff. But I invite you, look at some of those shooters and what they've left behind in terms of writing. Some of them explicitly say, the more people I kill, the more I'll be in the spotlight. They say that explicitly. And then they go out and go to a school or to a mall and kill many people. And so they've said it. That's what they want. I want to be famous. I want to get the recognition that I don't get in real life. And maybe I'm bullied at school, or something else is going wrong, or I have mental health problems, or I got problems in my family. I want to be famous. And that's how I become famous. So that alone, like if you don't believe in any of the statistics, that alone should give you pause and think about, wait a minute, we should do something about this. But I think to answer your question, there has to be public pressure on the news outlets to call out types of reporting. And then there's going to be a conversation about it. I think if we don't have that, there's no incentive for that entire cohort of journalists to change the reporting pattern that they've been following for the past years and decades. And we don't have that public pressure at the moment, I think, in any of our countries.
That's a very good point, actually. That's why we are actually doing this interview to increase this public pressure. And maybe also the point is that the public does not understand this interconnection really properly as you do now, because you can be now pretty sure that there's a causal effect. More publishing, with more publishing, we are creating more attackers. This is now clear and evidence-based, let's say.
It is.
Uh, as you have given the example that also the attackers themselves claimed that I want to be famous. Okay, what more evidence the media needs? We as public, we need to know more about this interconnection. So my question is, what was the media coverage of the results of your research, actually?
That's a good question. So there were different types of journalists. Some genuinely asked to better understand it. And I felt like in some conversations, it was quite a constructive conversation where they said like, oh yeah, that's something to think about. Now, if they did that in the next 3, 6, 12 months, I don't know. But others were very defensive. It's like, just along the lines of, oh yeah, with your statistics, you can show anything you want and all of that stuff. I mean, I remember one journalist who was very much taken aback by it, and he asked me, "So, do you think we cause deaths?" And I said, "In fact, yes, you are causing deaths." And then immediately, but free speech, and now you're putting blame on me as opposed to the shooter. It's like, of course, the shooter is at fault. We don't need to debate that. But you have power. A journalist has power. If I get a platform of writing in the New York Times, I have power. And I think that's very clear in all domains, really. And that is in part that is fine, but with power comes responsibility. That means you need to reflect. And like you said, if the amount of evidence is so strong that some type of reporting has very negative consequences in our society, then I think it is your responsibility to react and take that into account and think about how you could do better. So in that sense, I've been relatively disappointed of journalists over the last few years and how nothing has changed. In fact, if anything, it's gotten worse probably in terms of there being more sensationalist coverage. And yeah, it's a good question to ask where to start and how to get the ball rolling. I think public pressure on journalists and calling it out when you see clearly sensationalist coverage of an event like that, I think is important.
Absolutely, we agree with you. And the whole purpose of us doing interviews and trying to attract people's attention to the responsibility of consuming and sharing information, because for the sake of sensationalism and getting fame, again, shooters want fame, and the journalists who are using them to create a sensational story also want fame. So in the way, they are not only committing a similar crime by creating more shootings, but they are also driven by the very same motive in a way. And of course, calling them out, if you specifically calling out such people, they will be very defensive because they know they're doing socially dangerous and violent thing by provoking violence in the society. And on the other hand, decent journalists who are not propagandists, who don't have agenda, like you said in the very beginning, you said some of them using this topic to push certain political agenda, to ban Second Amendment, to ban gun rights. And excuse me, if we're looking at the countries with the most strict gun laws, well, we've seen Shinzo Abe being attacked in Japan, for example, with the most strict gun laws. We've seen school shootings and knife attacks in the countries of Central and Western Europe where you cannot get guns. And in the countries like Netherlands, I spoke to one person and they were bragging, I'm from Netherlands, we never had shootings here. All I had to do is to Google knife attacks in Netherlands schools. And isn't it the very same thing? Like, what is the difference? And uh, basically, same attacks. Number of victims is also extremely high. I've seen this in Eastern Europe. The whole movement when in social media networks in early 2000s, there started appearing fan clubs of not Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and Britney Spears, but of Columbine movement. And to me, it was shocking. Like, how is it something you can admire, glorify? So, and then I'm finding out there are books written about this two guys from Columbine. There are, everything detailed up to a meal they had that morning. There are cosplay costumes for Halloween. There are theme parties, and excuse me, but what are we creating? But the question I wanted to ask you is when you are going through an article, and you said all of us, we're like, people, generally, people can distinguish between sensationalism and informative journalism. And when you looking through the articles, were you able to see or maybe even to do a research on what percentage of coverage was healthy informative and what percentage was actually sensationalism? And have you been looking into this part?
So I'm an economist by training, and we like to define things clearly. And because it's so hard from text to define this is sensationalist and this is informational, we haven't done exactly what you're asking us to do. But I've browsed hundreds, probably thousands of these articles. And if you ask me to pinpoint a percentage, I'd say 80% of them are sensationalist. I mean, this is a rough sort of guesstimate that I'd put down. Most of them are, where if you read them, is there any additional informational content compared to what you've written yesterday? Not really. So, for example, in the context of terrorism, I've looked at this at some point, and people like Osama bin Laden are incredibly famous. Incredibly famous. The New York Times was obsessed with the guy. And I've just looked at how many articles do they talk about him? And in some years, it was more than the top 10 of the Forbes world famous people list combined. So think about it, it was crazy. They gave Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden a platform that is unprecedented in history. Unprecedented. And that's exactly what he wanted. Like we know his communications. That's exactly what he wanted. And they've given him that. So there's an additional twist when you go to politically violent groups and terrorism in terms of mass shootings. But we know they all want the fame and they are getting it. So to answer your question, there's no way you can tell me you have to write 10,000 articles in a year that are all about Osama bin Laden and that are all informational. There's just no way. And some of them are how many cats he had as a kid. And do we need to know that? Like, do we need to know what his grandma had for breakfast? I mean, there are just many of them where, like you said, we look at it and we immediately realize it's sensationalist. But objectively defining what is sensationalist and what is informational, I don't think that's our job. I mean, you can sort of look at it and get a good idea of it. But I think a journalist knows. Like if you talk with a journalist, not through a microphone, but over a beer, they know. They know, like that's their profession. And their profession is in part to sort of make stuff a bit more salacious and get sort of the wow moments in there. But it just seems in the context of shootings, A, it has gotten completely out of hand. And then B, the most concerning is obviously that it does have negative consequences. So yeah, my sort of admiration for journalists at most of the media outlets has been progressively dropping because I just see them repeatedly in this cycle again and again making the same mistakes. So a few months ago, I think that was a quite saddening example. It was a BBC article about the rise of shootings in the United States. And 3/4 of the article was about gun laws and gun rights. And you could immediately tell after the first paragraph, the author claimed to have looked at the scientific research on the topic why there are more shootings, but the only topic she was talking about was the gun rights. And I know that literature, she was misrepresenting it too. So not only did she pick the one cause that she wanted to advance politically, she also misrepresented the scientific evidence on it. But she made it sound as though she's done the research on it. She hasn't, I can tell you that, because I know that literature. And that is very, the layperson looks at it as like, wow, that journalist really has done the research, and it seems that gun rights are the major factor. That's just not true. The empirical evidence doesn't show that at all. That doesn't mean I advocate for or against gun rights. That's a different question. But I think journalists in many domains really have gotten away from their main profession, which is reporting the news and providing information. Rather, political content is being pushed a lot, especially on such contentious issues as gun rights, for example. So yeah, it's just all quite concerning. And I mean, I've two children. I mean, some of you might have kids, and that's the absolute nightmare that in your school there's an event like that. And it keeps happening more and more. So I think we need to urgently find solutions to this. And that involves not only talking about the news reporting, but also about the other underlying factors of these disengaged members of societies who then get into the vicinity of thinking about something like that. So there's many factors that contribute to this rise in shootings, I think.
Absolutely. Basically, after each event, the whole society, after being bombarded with such magnifying glass of, looking into this event, it just shares terror across society. One of the best comparisons is like, medieval French way of torturing and killing people, so-called criminals on the Central Plaza, where a huge crowd would gather and they all watch how the head is separated from the body of a person who is most likely was innocent. This is Age of Terror in France. And the act of terror, the act of executing person was aimed not to punish the person, but to raise fear in the society, and society had to be in fear of the authorities. And right now we are seeing the consequence of such media coverage for past 20 years, this constant magnification of fear and terror in the society. Right now you don't need to gather people in the central square and watch them somebody being executed. You can just launch a massive campaign of terror through the media. And this is exactly what is so-called sensationalism, and then point them to the wrong enemy. Once again, for political purpose, to give them the wrong answer, right? As they say, each problem has an answer that is simple, straightforward, and incorrect. Absolutely false, right? And they given you the fear, their terror through the media coverage, and they point you at the wrong thing to be outraged. So people who sincerely worry about their children, now there is a huge tension in the society rising because people understand we need to protect our children, but the only answer given is not to have a healthy media field in which children wouldn't be bombarded by such information, but to point them at the gun laws, point to all that. That's the only way you're supposed to react to each one of these things. And if you don't react this way, you are accused of being basically pro such events, for continuation of such events, which creates a tremendous tension in the society. So if I would imagine I would want to destroy society from within and make people hate each other, wouldn't it be a perfect instrument to use? Do you see the negative effect on the society and separation and clash in the society because of usage of such articles?
Um, yeah, you could talk a long time about that question. I mean, one observation I think is that many of these topics have become so politicized that you have to respond with emotion. So if I don't support gun control, then I don't want to protect the children. It's immediately getting emotional, whereas we should have a rational debate about here's the problem: rising number of shootings and knife attacks and all of these public displays of violence. How can we work against it? Okay, what does the scientific evidence say? There are like 3, 4, 5 candidates of potential causes. It may be a combination of them are at work. It may be some more than others. It may be some else that we don't know yet. But I don't think we have a scientific platform of talking about this, a constructive, rational platform of trying to bring together ideas. It could be gun rights. I don't know. Maybe gun rights do play a role. The empirical evidence is not that strong about it, but that doesn't mean it is not a factor. we could bring all these to the table, debate what we could do in which domain and where we have empirical evidence, how strong it is, and so on. But we're not doing that. We're making emotional arguments about, oh, we need gun rights, and all of this, or something else, whatever your own political agenda is. So we should have a rational basis to talk about potential solutions to these problems. And these are very emotional events, so it's hard. It's hard to leave emotion out of policy solutions to these problems. That's the first thing. The other perspective, which I found incredibly insightful, is from a sociologist of the 70s, actually. And what he suggested is that, let's take an example of when you were a teenager. Did you ever put gum under your table, under your desk in school? You may have done that. Why did you do that? It is, well, because the other kids did it. When I went to high school, probably 50% of the kids did that at some time. So why don't we do it now anymore? If you ask a teenager now, they think it's gross and disgusting and the worst thing ever. Why? Because nobody does it. So the point that researcher was trying to make is that a certain action, like something very inconsequential as putting a gum under your desk, we see it as feasible depending on how many people around us are doing it. And the concern with mass shootings is the more we make this public, the more we debate this, the more we show, look at this shooter, look at that shooter, and look at all of them, the more those individuals who are mentally on the fringes of potentially doing that, the more it becomes a potential option for them. So if somebody who is really troubled mentally and for whatever reason may become a mass shooter, if they don't read about it, if they don't read about these Columbine shooters and these other people that have become heroes and famous people, if they don't read about them, they may not follow that path. They may do something else, but not as violent, right? But the more we talk about it, so there's not just this political dimension, but there's a very clear argument to say the more we talk about it, the more we put it into some people's minds that, yeah, that's an option, something I could do to become famous because I see it works. Yeah, but again, I think much of that debate is based on emotion and not on a rational approach, putting all the options on the table, all the theories and all the empirical evidence on the table. Why is this happening? And then without a political background, but thinking from a constructive societal perspective, how can we decrease the number of shootings? And then proposing avenues. I never see that. I only see an emotional pushing of your own political agenda, like gun rights, for instance.
You mentioned that actually also this feasibility or this feeling of feasibility plays a role and is one of the factors that should be taken into account. There's also one option. I was just thinking about that. If there was no such sensationalism, media coverage about these Columbines and everything, there could be also an option for these attackers to even develop in normal way. Maybe if there wasn't such, toxic informational field, maybe they could have developed in a normal way and have a normal life.
Yes.
Also, this option is, we don't know. And you mentioned BBC article actually, distorting the data, the actual evidence, just, watching at the problem of guns. This is an example of, losing responsibility from the point of media. There's also responsibility on the part of our part. Our part is public, because if we do not demand such news, such sensationalism, then there wouldn't be so many articles, so many movies, so many everything about that. So there's also a very important role of us. And if we just talk about freedom of speech, like that, we don't want to jeopardize it. On the other hand, we are living in democratic countries, and we should be, we have a right for safety. That's our right. That's our human right for safety, right? So if the so-called freedom of speech actually attacks another human right, then isn't actually democracy failing in this way? And shouldn't we actually also solve it at the law level, at the justice level, so that actually the factual informing is absolutely okay, but sensationalism that actually brings danger to our lives, to our children, is not acceptable by no way. I don't know. It's just discussion for discussion.
Yeah, yeah, that's a stronger argument, a stronger measure to deal with it, to come up with laws against that. And that's difficult because for one, as we've talked about, it's really difficult to say what's sensationalist and what isn't, and that border is often fluent between these things. But I think it would be much easier. I think if media editors came together and journalists and thought about sensitive topics like suicides, but included shootings in that, and thought about those more carefully, and learned and agreed upon some guidelines, just like they do for reporting on suicide, and think about developing something like this around shootings, that would go a long way. I don't think we need rules and laws that prohibit sensationalist coverage in that dimension. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm too naive. But I do think that that domain could self-regulate. But for that, there needs to be public pressure. And somebody needs to point out, this BBC article is sensationalist. And that reporter is purely pushing sensationalist motives. And there's no informational content about the shootings. So he or she should in some way be held accountable. And that discussion I just don't see. But of course, journalists don't like to criticize themselves. I mean, I understand that. And that's why the BBC journalist, she didn't even mention that media coverage of shootings may be a cause of other shootings. She never mentioned that entire article, which I also found very concerning, because she claimed to summarize what causes shootings and what the scientific theories are out there. She only mentioned one and misrepresented that. So yeah, I think the only way is public pressure on journalists, and they say, no, this type of article you shouldn't write, and then there should be some sort of consequences by the people, maybe to boycott a news outlet. I don't know, but something. I think if there's a group that gets together that somehow mobilizes public action, I think that's the best way to generate some pressure on journalists to make them rethink, because I don't think it would be too hard for them to do that. But at the moment, there's no political will by journalists to do that, as far as I can tell.
Absolutely. And we've seen this on sensitive topics when people start, talking about certain sensitive points on social media, create a huge social demand for certain things, and then media outlets, they have to react. Otherwise, people will unsubscribe, cancel subscription, and that's it. And that is the best democratic capitalist way of influencing things. You get in together and you vote with your dollars or pounds or whatever currency, euros there is. And that is the best way. But in order to do that, there has to be some sort of evidence, right? And we came across your research and we were just stunned. Like, here it is. Here is scientific evidence. Have you seen any similar works, or maybe articles, or that was a great example with the French newspaper. Have you seen any other people concerned and trying to bring this up for discussion on the public stage?
So one reaction here in Australia, I've talked with a couple of journalists, and they gave me an example that's very Australia specific that I found interesting, and that concerns bar fights, actually. So Australia is a former British colony, so lots of bar fights. That's my joke about the British people. But lots of bar fights. And what used to happen quite a bit is that somebody got punched from the back in their neck and then fall down and break their neck, which is very dangerous. And that actually happened quite frequently in the past. And what it was usually called was, I think, a king hit, which makes this, king hit sounds very majestic and sort of it's an honorable thing to do, but it's not at all, right? Like if two people fight each other and you get attacked from behind, that's rather cowardly. So two journalists actually told me they were radio reporters. They had radio shows, and they just changed the name of that. They didn't call it a king hit anymore, but they called it, I think, a coward's punch. And their point was, and they were convinced that it had an effect, that people were doing it less because it now had a name that wasn't very elegant and majestic, but was sort of a coward's punch, right? And they suggested that just the language we use about shooters, just what we call them, may go a long way. And their evidence, of course, very anecdotal in the sense that they see their audience and they like to see what they can see. So it's not really a scientific evidence, but that I found that quite interesting. So their suggestion was just not necessarily the frequency and how much we talk about them, but just how we talk about. And rather than elevating them and making them sort of this fearful figure, it's rather ridiculing them, is what they suggested. I've not seen that in other countries in other contexts, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I may just have not seen it. But that's another way of thinking about it, just what sort of agency and what sort of aura do we give a shooter?
That's incredible because, yeah, I bet not many people would like to brag about coward punching someone in a bar. You showed the example with a suicide. I've never seen glorification or, fan club of someone who committed suicide specifically for that reason, right? And usually those people are not being presented in the way that would in any way push other people to do so. Opposite of that, I'm seeing everywhere, call this number if you have some self-harm thoughts. I've never seen anywhere that call this number if you think about committing uh, mass shooting or school shooting. I've never even seen this brought up. I'm only seeing, as you said, magification or glorification of people who already committed crime. So, of course, and when I was reading some of the articles on this topic, I'm seeing intrusive thoughts from the people. Like they are writing in their diaries before committing crimes that they actually do not want to do this, but they have some sort of thoughts that they cannot find, that they are pushing them to commit this crime. So either something psychological or as a virus, as a malicious information, some sort of program starts operating in their minds. And the question is, where did they pick up this
Yeah.
information? How come that nobody was looking into that?
You mean looking in terms of how we could inform potential shooters and how they can get help, or just the topic in general and from an empirical perspective?
Yeah. How can we inform potential shooters that they
Yeah,
need to reach out for help? That's definitely a very important question. Because many of them were asking for help. Many of them were actually talking to their teachers and so on, but they've been sent home, and then a few days after, you see a tragedy on the news.
absolutely. I think that would be a great step towards thinking about them not just as perpetrators but also as victims in some ways, which I don't want to in any way take away from an actual victim of that and say the perpetrator is the victim, but in part, like you say, there are often sort of developments in that individual's environment, and maybe there's abuse or neglect or other things that happen in the background that make people consider that as an option. And like you said, it would be fantastic to have under these articles, if you feel any sort of impulse, or however you want to phrase it, much better than I would now, then please call this number and we can get you help. I think that would be quite important. I think another way of thinking about reporting on these shootings is look at how much attention is dedicated to the shooter and how much is dedicated to the victims. So if you look at articles about suicide, every single word you can tell is crafted very carefully. It talks about the victim, it talks about the family and how they try to help and how many people are left behind and how they are victimized and so on. Like any of the major shootings where you can, if you do a little bit of research, name the shooters immediately. How many victims can you name? Have you read anywhere about, this 6-year-old girl who happened this and that and had her whole life in front of you? We never talk about that in the news. We only talk about the perpetrator, only about the shooter. So one way to think about this is the quantity of coverage, but also what is covered. It's 90% or more the shooter, and that in a glorifying way, like you said, in a way that is sort of like, oh my God, look at what that person did. other than trying to understand how did that person potentially become ill, in quotation marks, mentally, to do that, and how could we prevent that, and how could we, like you said, that's a great idea to say, if you have any such thoughts, here's an anonymous helpline, or here's where you can seek help without being arrested immediately. But I think you're right. If you look at the diary entries or the social media posts of many of them, some of them announced it in the days, weeks before, that I want to go out and do this. Or some of them send very clear signs for help. I want help, and that's not heard. So we need to get better at picking up those signs as well, and then in a constructive way trying to help that person rather than to demonize them and putting them in a corner. So I think that's a great approach too. And that's something we should talk about together with policymakers, with researchers, with media executives, with journalists, to come together and see how we can report better on that topic. And this could be part of it. That's a great idea. Yeah.
Thank you. And many of them actually do survive. Some of them, of course, commit suicide. Some of them are being shot, but many of them do survive. With those who do survive, do you think, have you ever thought that it would actually be of a great benefit for psychiatrists to work with them to find out exactly the point where they started having these intrusive thoughts?
I think that's a great idea. Again, that's a very rational approach to trying to best understand what is happening and where we could potentially intervene and then help these individuals. And it wouldn't only be, I think it wouldn't only be to try and find out what kind of news they consume, but there's also a valid theory is to say that some computer games might make somebody more prone to doing that. I can't speak to that. I don't know. But you could put all the hypotheses on the table, including gun rights. Like, again, I'm agnostic. I don't know if gun rights or not have this effect on mass shootings. I have some idea about it, but I'm a researcher. I'm an empirical researcher. I like to see the evidence, and according to the evidence, I'd like to see policy being made. So you could test all kinds of theories by doing exactly what you suggested, and I think that is something that one reason why I started doing empirical research on this, because I was shocked to see how little, if anything, there is empirically in terms of trying to go out and testing these theories. And that is such a big topic in our societies, and it's a growing topic. So there should be much more research on this, and I haven't seen as much. And part of that could exactly be speaking with those shooters who do survive and trying to really understand their psyche and where was the point where they tipped over, and can we somehow identify that point in others potentially in social media posts, in whatever else, in diary entries, in how they communicate with their teachers and their family and so on, and then possibly get an early warning system. But if that is being done in any of our countries, I haven't read about that, and maybe I'm not informed enough, but I think that's something we should do. Yeah.
Absolutely, I absolutely agree with you. And just one point that usually people who can back up their position with data, they use empirical data. But people who have political agenda and have not so strong data trying to use emotional statements to switch off the rational thinking of the audience, because emotional topics, especially such as children, will always do so. And please, Carolina, I know you wanted to ask the next question.
I just wanted to comment on this, maybe one of our last question regarding all this. We have studied this topic, as we have dived a little into it, finding the research. We have noticed that actually also the sensationalism that is used in describing these mass shootings, these school shootings, that is quite similar to so-called politics shooting. That is, for example, some media, they're using the same language, let's say in a very negative way towards some politician, towards some, or even more, it doesn't have to be specific politician, but political parties. And actually then the attacker that appears, for example, as Tali mentioned, in Japan, Shinzo Abe was actually shot by an attacker. That actually it's like quite a similar development, that like quite a normal person. Also, there was a politics shooting this year or last year in Slovakia on a prime minister by a man that was quite absolutely, there was no problem with him before. And after a very, serious media coverage, very negative media coverage, he decided that the only solution of his country to become normal is to kill the prime minister, and he tried to do so. So this is quite interesting that we have found quite a similar pattern in that so-called lone wolf appearing from nowhere after a kind of media coverage. It's suspicious that it's the consequence of media coverage. So this is just our observation that we wanted to share, that we see some similarities in that.
Yeah. The political background, that's an additional layer of complication. If it's somebody who has a political agenda, then the fame we give to that person gains another dimension. If it's an Islamist terrorist or a far-right extremist or a separatist or anybody who's got a strong political agenda behind it, then there's an additional reason as to why we should be really careful in talking about their background, because that's exactly what they want. In addition to the individual fame, they want the political idea to be out there. So there are more dimensions to this. And again, I've not seen more empirical analysis after our papers. This warrants a lot more analysis from empirical researchers, in addition to theorists from psychology, from political science, from economics, and so on, from all communication studies. But there's nowhere near enough, which is still shocking to me because it's such an important topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And to the point that Carolina was making, when I was looking in the statistics, generally when it comes to political violence is skyrocketing in US and Europe, and specifically democratic states, in last 15, 20 years. And at first, the blame was in the media. The blame appears to be on the far right, so-called far right. They were blamed for everything. But then the data, as you said, empirical data shows other stuff, that far right, and including AfD in Germany, are being attacked themselves with much higher intensity than ever before by either far left or so on. So violence rising across all spectrums. And with that, if in case with school shooters, we're seeing glorification. In case with politicians, we're seeing more and more demonization, to the point where members of Congress of the U.S. are now seeing 10 times more threats a year than 6 years ago. So it used to be 800. Now it's 8,000. Like it goes by numbers of magnitude. So have you noticed also similarities with the way that tension in the society is being driven up by negative, I would even say very fatalistic things, like if this person will stay as a prime minister of our country, or if this person becomes a president, the democracy will end forever. This sort of things clearly pushing people who are, as you mentioned before, on the edge of committing something bad, to basically justifying them doing this bad thing. And Prime Minister of Slovakia, after assassination on Donald Trump, he said, "Well, that's the very same blueprint. If you just wanted somebody to commit something like that in the U.S., they only had to read Slovak media and copy paste that in the American outlets, which basically was done because kind of words were used, very similar." And the same thing was in Japan. By the way, the very interesting thing that in Japan, Shinzo Abe was killed by a person who was on websites searching information about Unification Church, and according to him, Shinzo Abe was supporting evil cult. So because of that, he was supposed to be eliminated. That was a justification. In In Slovakia, it was demonization of President Fico because, again, with the same thing that he belongs to apparently enemies of all democracy and some sort of political cult. And then we're looking at the US, and oh my gosh, we're seeing that a cult of MAGA, cult of Donald Trump is basically books are glorified, CNN, BBC, everybody inviting this anti-cult activists, and basically saying the science is settled. That's a cult. America has to be deprogrammed. Even higher politicians were saying things like that. If that's not a justification of a violence towards a person, then I don't know what is. Why do you think informational part of such events, whether it's mass shootings, crimes, or political violence, why is it so ignored?
I look, if I had the answer to that question, I'd be famous and rich. And um, I think you're right. In general, the degree of emotionality and polarization and political discussion has increased substantially. I mean, I've lived in the US for 6 years, and whoever I talk to there, they are either Democrat or Republican, but there's no, like, you cannot be the other. It's very extreme, which is you're either part of one and then you're a terrible person, or you're part of the other and then you're fine. But what we had like 10, 20 years ago or so was, we have this large platform that we agree debating on. So should we raise taxes or should we lower taxes? Should we keep them the same? And we can debate it, and it's fine if we disagree, that's all right. But I think we've just become much less comfortable disagreeing with each other. Like, it's perfectly fine if we discuss a policy topic and we exchange our arguments, our facts, our ideas, our theories. And then if we disagree in the end, that's fine. We can still be friends. We can still sit at the same dinner table. But I know quite a few friends in the US whose family got broken up because of the elections in the US. Just because one person supports Trump or Clinton or now Harris, and it's been completely broken up. But we've kind of lost the ability to disagree with each other and then debate, but still respect each other on many of these topics. And if you think about them from an informational content, they're not too different from 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. We talk about safety at the border. We talk about safety in our society. We've been doing this since we've had societies. We're talking about economic freedom. We're talking about how we deal with crime. I mean, that's in every election that I could think of in any country has been a topic. So if I say I support Trump or I support Harris, why do I immediately have to be pushed in a corner? And I think the tone in the public debate about that, including by journalists who are increasingly just picking their camp and then sticking to it and refusing to engage in a constructive way with people from the other camp, I think that does us a fundamental disservice. And I do think the theory does suggest that this leads to more political violence down the road as well. Because like you said, if I'm convinced that if that person wins the election, our country is going to go to hell, then somebody's much more likely to become violent towards that candidate. And from theory, it's very clear that how journalists and the news talk about these topics, that does inform the likelihood of somebody becoming politically violent. And that's very concerning. And so I remember when I was in the US, I had quite a few friends who are Republican and quite a few friends who are Democrat, and it was completely fine. We had debates about stuff, we disagreed, and sometimes we agreed, and it's perfectly fine. Now it's impossible. You're either or, and if you're the other, then you're deleted as a friend almost. Like that cannot be the future in our democracies. Like, we need to be able to disagree and then still find a constructive way forward and keep disagreeing. That's fine, and then we exchange our ideas. And I think in many European countries it's going that way. I think in Germany it's that with the AfD, and in many other countries it's with some parties and some groups that are just being pushed in a corner. And I don't think that's very constructive in our democracies. That's very dangerous.
Exactly. You mentioned actually, or if we are talking about the influence of media, we can discuss on all the consequences for the society, as we can see that even the media maybe and is highly probably also responsible for this, mood in the society to discuss or not to discuss together, to get to the table and come to some constructive solution. thank you very much for joining us today, for your insight, for the the results of your research that you have shared with us. It was very inspiring. We are very happy to conduct the ideas further as a, let's say, responsible public. And is there something that you would like to wish to the viewers?
Um, yeah, I think a key point for me that I keep coming back to is let's stay constructive. Let's disagree with each other. It's fine. Let's try to find rational solutions to the problems we have in our society and bring the racist uncle to the table. It doesn't help if you just demonize them and cut them out. You need to understand where people are coming from. And that helps us to find solutions together to our problems. One of them is the rising number of mass shootings and mass violence. And it is something we need to address, and we need to address together in a constructive way. I'd like to see that, if anything.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your research and thank you for the really unique work you have been doing. It's definitely something that needs to be heard by the society. We believe there are many people who want to hear this. And not just your research, but these incredible examples of healthy approach to issues and examples of healthy ways to deal with it. Like there are good approaches and positive examples you presented today. We hope our viewers are going to watch it and start sharing it and basically create the very same public demand we have been talking about because everything starts from little actions of um, ordinary people. So thank you so much for being with us, for sharing this information. And our dear viewers, please write in the comment section below your thoughts, your examples, and maybe you have seen positive or negative examples. Let's share our experience and find out what can we do to make our society safer, healthier, and prosperous, the one in which our children would actually feel safe. So, Michael, thank you so much for being with us, and we hope to see you in our future interviews with your future research. I'm sure you'll have a lot more articles to do and a lot more research articles to publish. We wish you the luck and new ways to develop your research. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure and an honor, and all the best from Perth. Thank you, guys.